Hello everybody, this is the Wikstrand. James Bond films are not your standard spy movie. James Bond is not your standard action movie. And that is because that sometimes during these movies, not everybody but most of them, there is this one moment that is just, oh my god, you just look at it with awe and sometimes with glee, because they can be so silly, they can be so insane and so ridiculous that on paper it shouldn't work, but because the producers, the directors and the participants actually believe that this could work, it actually worked. So today we're going to take a look at the 20 greatest sequences, scenes and moments from the James Bond franchise. So here we go! The rules or the criteria for this list is a little vague because this can basically be any length of a sequence, but it has to sort of be connected with each other. It can both be a 1-second shot to a 15-minute sequence. It all depends on how it is stitched together and how good it is. But apart from that, everything is fair game. Number 20, from Goldfinger, the opening. Prior to Goldfinger, the opening of a James Bond film was essentially to, show off the villains and, open up a kind of, ooh, what's this about then? But Goldfinger kind of changed that. James Bond shows up in some South American country and blows up, some silos with drugs or stuff like that. And then he gets involved in a 1960s style movie fight, which always looks a little bit contrived and silly, but we'll deal with it. He throws a fan into a bathtub and shocks the guy in it and says shocking, and then he bangs some chick. That's the opening, and it made him look so fucking awesome. Also, I'm seeing double, I think. Number 19, from Casino Royale, the torture sequence. I still think that this sequence is a little bit too gruesome for its own good, but it still shows how awesome James Bond is and how tough he is, and it also contains one of the most unexpected humoristic sequences in all of James Bond films, because where it is placed, you don't expect an entire auditorium of moviegoers to burst out laughing when your hero is being tortured, when the villain is punching his dick with a rope. And somehow he was able to crack out a joke. Not only was it unexpected, not only was it defiant, but it also showed something about his character, and that elevated the sequence from gruesome to gruesome with a James Bond twist. Who could ask for more? 18, from For Your Eyes Only. Bond kicks down a car. After all the cartoonic nonsense of The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, the producers wanted to make James Bond a slightly more grounded character with a little more vicious edge to him, with a little more grit to him. After the henchman has killed the woman that Bond has made love to, that is, by the way, a hazard to your health. If you have made love with James Bond, there is a very big chance that you will get killed within the next 10 to 15 minutes. That is exactly what happens here, and James Bond is then being chased by, the hitman, and it ends up with a car just on the edge of a cliff, and James Bond takes his, the victim's, what was it, a necklace or stuff like that, and throws it in, which makes the weight slowly tipping the car over. But Bond isn't satisfied there. He just takes and kicks it over the cliff and, goes, there you go. It is a sequence that Roger Moore feels a little bit. He did that. It feels more like a Daniel Craig move or a Timothy Dalton move, actually. I don't even think that it would have felt at home with Pierce Brosnan. But it is a small little detail that just made Bond for a second a little bit more badass during the more cartoonish era, which made it more badass. I really love that sequence. Number 17, from Skyfall, Fighting in Shanghai. If we're just talking about cinematography and scope, Skyfall is the greatest James Bond film of all time, because it looks so motherfucking big, you guys. But the sequence that I took away from there is actually one of the more intimate, smaller sequences. I love it so much. James Bond is following Ola Rapace, who, you know, shoots him in the beginning of the movie. By the way, is it one of the only times that James Bond has actually been shot in a movie? He very rarely does get shot. He gets beat up sometimes, but very rarely shot. Anyway, he follows Ola Rapace up, you know, one of these skyscrapers in Shanghai, where he is going to assassinate somebody across the street. It is then up to Bond to try to, you know, get some information out of him. The entire sequence is shot in complete silence, and it is lit in such a way that we're only seeing two silhouetted men fighting with a backdrop of neon lights. It looks fucking amazing. Number 16, from Moonraker, Jaws becomes a good guy. Everything about Moonraker is stupid, and everything about Jaws is extra stupid, and he kind of lost his evil villain, you know, assassin thing that he had, you know. In The Spy Who Loved Me, Jaws was a silent, deadly, evil assassin that looked kind of like Frankenstein's monster with Dracula's teeth. It was so silly. The thing was that he was put through a Wile E. Coyote style of, you know, falling off high things and being covered in rubble and stuff like that. It was cartoonish as fuck. And then in Moonraker, they amped it up even more. Not only did they give him a 5'4", 5'2" tall girlfriend with pigtails and glasses. Not only did, you know, they make him even more of a cartoonish Wile E. Coyote style villain, but they made him a good guy. Apparently, Jaws had so much fan letters from especially children saying, oh, we want Jaws to be a good guy. And for once, I agree with the children. And the sequences where Jaws' hand comes up, you know, behind the guard and, you know, drags him away. It looks like a, you know, a big pile of bananas coming to you if you yank you away. And the fact is, he survives the damn thing and saves the world in the end. Despite Moonraker Station blowing up completely. I have no idea how it works, but I'm just so glad that Jaws somewhere is enjoying the good life together with his very short wife and are having weird children now. And that makes me happy. Number 15, from Octopussy, The Chase in Udaipur. Octopus is a vastly underrated James Bond film, but the best thing about the whole movie was a chase in the beginning of the movie in Udaipur, where, you know, they have these tuk-tuks and they're having fakirs and, you know, snake charmers, and they're throwing money on people, and it is so silly and it has so many great iconic moments. And also the funniest thing is that I've actually walked through the streets where they shot the sequence in Udaipur, and they just play this movie everywhere, you know, the hotels where they shot the whole thing and stuff like that. The chase in Udaipur just have so much creativity to it. I love it. Number 14, from You Only Live Twice. James Bond's wife is murdered. You Only Live Twice is one of my favorite James Bond films of all time. There is just one sequence in this entire fantastically silly, stupid, big, bold movie that I wanted to change, cut or trim. The sequence where James Bond is disguised as a Japanese man, you know, living on this island before they, you know, attack the volcano. I say this mostly because this entire sequence was kind of dragging and was kind of uninteresting. Some snowflakes will say that he goes yellow-faced, maybe, but I don't even think he looked Japanese. I just thought that he looked like Sean Connery, with a slightly more silly haircut and, you know, his Japanese wife. His wife was, you know, an agent and all that good stuff. Just to show you how insanely unnecessary this entire sequence was, Spectre is pretty much onto Bond from the start. Why couldn't you make him pose like a tourist or something like that? And they tried to kill him in the most contrived, but at the same time, one of the most elegant ways I have ever seen. Because they're, you know, sleeping and we're having the assassin above them. Why he doesn't take a gun, just shoots him in the face, I don't know. But it's a James Bond film, you're going to have to live with this. And so it takes this very long string. And puts venom in it and it just, you know, trickles down it, and Bond turns away and she turns over and the poison, you know, falls into her mouth instead, and you know, she dies. It is still one of the most elegant ways I've ever seen anybody, you know, is assassinated in any form of a movie. And it is maybe one of the greatest assassination sequences in cinema history. It's not nearly talked about enough, but it is one of my favorite when it comes to it. Number 13, from GoldenEye, A Visit to Q Branch. In the more gadget-heavy era of James Bond, the visit to Q Branch was always one of my favorite moments of the movie, where, you know, James Bond goes and have all his, you know, stuff that he's going to use at one point during the movie. Where we also see, you know, Q displaying other stuff that other agents uses, for especially the, you know, tea tray that decapitates people. I want that ready for Ahmed's tea party, as Q says. One of the key elements of why these sequences were so fun and worked so well was Desmond Llewellyn's commitment to the whole thing. He was an academic who just was so tired with this juvenile delinquent coming and touching his stuff and, you know, breaking them all the time. And after, you know, a 6-year hiatus, it felt like they had, you know, saved up all of their silly stuff to, you know, just present to the new James Bond. The Q Branch sequence in GoldenEye is by far the best because they have so many wacky, silly nonsense that they're showing off, you know, the phone booth thing and stuff like that. All capped off with a fantastic little thing where James Bond picks up a sandwich and says, "Well, what is this thing?" "Don't touch that! That's my lunch!" Q says. The perfect way to end the whole thing. Not only is it the longest of the Q Branch sequences, but it is also the best. Number 12. From The Man with the Golden Gun, the car jump. This sequence should have landed, you know, in the top 5 spot or something like that, but it is a bit hampered by the fact that they're putting in this silly cartoon sound effect when they are, you know, doing the jump. But as a whole, it is the most impressive car stunt I have ever seen in a movie. Simple put, they do a 360 roll in one take. It is breathtaking to see. Holy shit. Fuck that thing. Fuck you, sound designer. Number 11. From Live and Let Die. The boat chase in Louisiana. The high point, of which there are many actually in Live and Let Die, is of course the boat chase through the bayou. They put all their money into that basket basically. What makes the boat chase so great and grants it a spot on this list is the fact that it is a great mix of things. We're having J.W. Pepper's exciting, you know, prospects of catching these guys, and we have the spectacular stunt sequences, and we also have the comedy of, you know, them crashing a wedding and ending up in somebody's pool, and the end of things where J.W. Pepper finally finds him. "What are you, boy? Some kind of a doomsday machine, boy," he says to James Bond. And, you know, I think it's feeling lighter saying, no, he's one of the good guys. On whose side? Number 10. From Russia with Love. The Spectre training camp. This is so incredibly silly. It probably looked menacing. It probably looked evil and ominous when it was shown in the early 1960s. But when we're watching it, the only thing we can see is Dr. Evil. This is basically, you know, Dr. Evil's organization, you know, training to be badass terrorists. And it is so funny and it is so silly. There are so many moments where Rosa Klebb is walking there with and talking about what they're going to do, and they are throwing bombs and they are, you know, having these silly outfits on. You can't take it seriously. It is one of these rare moments where James Bond is so silly that it goes all the way back and becomes badass, only for it to go one way more and become so silly and badass at the same time that you cannot help but watch it with a big smile on your face, because it is so incredibly insane and so ludicrous, but it works in some weird fashion. My favorite sequence of that entire movie, and that movie is one of my favorite James Bond films, by the way, also. From Russia with Love. What a silly bunch of nonsense that was. Number 9. From Moonraker. Laser Wars in Outer Space. If you would go back in time and tell the movie-going audience of 1962 that in 17 years James Bond is going to fight bad guys in outer space and people are going to fly around and shoot, laser rifles at each other, they would say, what the fuck are you on? Are you nuts? But that is exactly what happened. When they're sending up these space shuttles filled with people with laser rifles who flies around and trying to shoot at each other, making the entire sequence look exactly like Star Wars, which was apparently the idea to capitalize on the success of Star Wars. This sequence is so outlandish they can never outdo it again, ever, no matter how much they try. You will always have the argument, well, did they go into outer space and shoot laser rifles at each other? And the people you argue with say, no, they did not. So that is not as outlandishly big, bad and silly. It's difficult to come up with new ways of saying how incredibly insane this is, but this was insane. When I saw this the first time, I said, what? How? Not only the time aspect of the whole thing, how long does it take to get a shuttle ready and be shot off? It feels like they did this in 10 minutes or something like that, completely equipped with people with laser rifles. It's bonkers. Did they have these laser rifle equipped astronauts ready to go to fight who exactly if Hugo Drax hadn't shown up? Best not to think about it too much, then you will just lose your mind or your brain will melt or something like that. Moonraker is just such a fantastic movie and such a bad movie in the same time, at the same time. Number 8, from Die Another Day, the fencing sequence. There was a lot of silly excess in Die Another Day, which kind of returned a little bit to James Bond's more cartoonish way of conducting his business. But there was one sequence that could have fit in any James Bond era and it would have felt right at home. James Bond goes in to confront Gustav Graves, the villain of the movie, in some kind of gentleman's club, and then he start to having fencing things with him, and it starts off innocent enough. But then when Gustav Graves isn't getting his way, he just picks up bigger and more destructive weaponry and trashes the entire gentleman's club. It is both a great sequence for James Bond, but it's also a very funny, elegant sequence where they didn't need to use any CGI and they didn't have to use any pyrotechnics at all, and it is still a spectacular sequence. Number 7, from The World Is Not Enough, the boat chase. The opening of The World Is Not Enough is one of my favorites in James Bond history. The thing is that the sequences Bilbao is completely okay. Nothing spectacular, but a fun little sequence. But what happens when they come back to London is something else. James Bond commandeers a not quite ready yet small little boat and chases after a assassin on another boat on the Thames. It's an incredibly epic sequence, not only because it is a really difficult thing to film on the Thames because of the permits and stuff like that. It's very rarely done, and they had the Thames all to itself for a very short moment of time, and they really uses it. But it also is a fun little sequence where James Bond takes the boat up on land and goes through I think it was a fish shop or a restaurant or stuff like that. It was very, very fun. It was spectacular, big, and it was the absolutely correct mix of modern and new, in my opinion, which you could summarize was the entirety of the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies. It was a throwback to the old James Bond films, but it kept it fresh anyway. And there is probably not a single sequence that encapsulated more than this sequence. Too bad that the rest of the movie couldn't follow it, huh? Number 6, from The Spy Who Loved Me, the ski jump. Some people may think that the sequence isn't that impressive. It's just a guy jumping off a cliff and then, falls his parachute. And that's the beginning of the movie. But the thing is that it was apparently one of the most dangerous stunts that has ever been committed, because apparently nobody had ever done this before. They talk about it a little bit on the behind the scenes sequences. They had one chance of doing this, and it is such a fantastic sequence. They don't do a single cut. And when the Union Jack unfolds and na 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 starts playing, apparently the audience just went ballistic. I can believe that. It is the perfect way to start a James Bond film, with something spectacular you've never seen before. Number 5. Escape from Slovakia. The Living Daylights is a very good James Bond film, and the best thing in this very good James Bond film is the escape from Slovakia. This is classic, old school Cold War spy things. Luring away the KGB, escaping with the girl, having a fun car chase. That is when, it stopped being a, Cold War spy movie and becomes a James Bond film in a Cold War setting. I love it. He's using his gadgets, they're being shot at, by tanks, I think. He's running his car across a frozen lake inside of a house, and in the end, they, enter, I think it was Austria, riding on a cello. It's by far the longest of the sequences on this list and the best Bond moment of the entire 1980s. Number 4, from You Only Live Twice, the ninja attack. There is not a sequence in the history of James Bond that is more James Bond than this. Blofeld is having, this secret lair underneath a fake lake in a, volcano, and he's having monorails and people in different red jumpsuits and stuff like that, and they're being attacked by hundreds and hundreds of ninjas on ropes that are, going down and throwing ninja stars and shooting people. It is spectacular beyond spectacular, just watching how much people it was. The sets are so massive, and the amount of people are so massive, and at the same time you're thinking, this is an evil organization, Dr. Evil style, that's being attacked by ninjas, on ropes with ninja stars. It is so incredibly silly, but at the same time it is so spectacular, which is sort of what makes James Bond such a fun movie experience. In this short sequence where they, rappels down, it's only about, a couple of seconds long, but it encapsulates everything that is great about the Bond franchise. It's silly and spectacular, and you've never seen anything like it before, and it is so easy to parody if you only, give it a shot. Number 3, from Moonraker, the fight in Venice. This sequence is painfully for me to watch because I love glasswork so much, and they are at this, museum with all these precious glassworks, and James Bond is, walking around there and is trying to, find out what Hugo Drax is planning, and all of a sudden a samurai or ninja dude comes up and tries to kill him with the samurai sword, and they're trashing the entire thing. And the thing is that before this, we have, had this tour where this guy says, oh, this costs so much and this costs so much. There's only one of this in the entire world, and they just throw each other into these precious works of glass, and it is so funny. At the same time, it is an intense sequence of James Bond, being attacked and, somebody's trying to kill him. And the whole thing ends with, James Bond just throwing him through a window, and he falls down into a piano or something like that. It's really fun. And this is such a sequence that on paper, it just feels like, your random movie fight sequence, but because of where they are and what they do to all these precious, unique items, it just elevates the sequence. When I rewatched these movies for the purpose of, doing all these lists, I couldn't stop laughing when, he shows up and they just kills everything. I don't think a single piece of glassware was intact when they were done with the whole thing. It's a spectacular sequence. Also worth noticing the gondola chase in Venice that precedes it. That is also a whole bunch of fun. Number 2, from Dr. No, James Bond's intro. This is probably on most people's number 1 list of their favorite James Bond sequence of all time. how a character is introduced. Indian cinema is the expert of introducing a character in such a way that you go, oh my god. Happy New Year is a pretty good example of it. But you can also do it a very low-key way. They're playing Baccarat in some, casino or something like that, and we get to see parts of James Bond. His hand is, flipping over the cards. He's not really saying anything. And then a woman says, I like your style, mister. And then we just see Sean Connery saying, Bond. James Bond. And the cigarette in his mouth is just flicking a little bit, and he just oozes charisma, machismo, and you're just feeling, oh my god, that is our hero. It is such an entrance, and it is made with so little resources, and they make so much with so little. It's fucking amazing. And number one, from GoldenEye, the tank chase. You have to believe me when I say that I didn't know that this thing was coming when I saw this movie in the cinema. I just assumed that James Bond was going to steal some car of some description and follow, the villains and, capture them. Then they go away and they wait just long enough, and then boom, the tank bursts through the wall and following them, and it is such a spectacular and totally unexpected sequence. And when James Bond is totally murdering all the cop cars and running through buildings and crushing statues, it's spectacular, it's big, it is silly, and it is James Bond. In the same way as the ninja attack from You Only Live Twice, this takes what could have been just an ordinary chase and amps it up just by introducing us to a tank. Well, it's not just that, it's everything else. It's how it's shot, it's how it's... And the tank actually, almost drifts when it, takes a turn. That is a small little fantastic moment in the movie that makes the sequence even greater, and it is my pick for the greatest James Bond sequence of all time. It might have something to do with it that this was the first James Bond film I saw in the cinema, and this sequence just felt so big and so epic when I saw it. So I'll see you next time from, well, so-and-so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching, thank you very much!